My name is Harold Pierce. I'm 74, and one day before Thanksgiving I learned my daughter was planning to humiliate me at her private gathering in Santa Rosa, California, and then throw me out. On November 21st, she called asking where I was. I told her to open my drawer. The silence that followed felt like a gun going off. I stood in the hallway while the phone line went dead, the hum of silence filling the corners of my old bones. I could feel it again. That creeping chill that had started weeks ago, when the house I'd once built into a home began changing without my say. Not suddenly. Not like a thunderclap. More like a slow leak behind a wall, silent and constant. The kind of damage you don't see until the floor buckles beneath your feet. The house I lived in for 30 years suddenly felt foreign. I noticed it first in the small things. My slippers, the ones my late wife Margaret had given me before her last Christmas, were gone from beside the bed. I used to slide into them without thinking, just as she used to hum when she stirred sugar into her tea. They vanished, and no one had an answer. "Maybe you put them somewhere else, Dad," my daughter would say, her voice light, distracted, already moving on. Then it was the photographs. The one of Margaret at the Grand Canyon, her scarf flying in the wind like a flag, was replaced by an abstract painting, all gray swirls and angles. I found the photo tucked away in a drawer with broken pens and takeout menus. My frame, my memory shelved like clutter. My favorite chair, a wide recliner Margaret insisted we splurge on because my knees would eventually betray me, disappeared next. Dylan, her fiancé, said it didn't match the cleaner aesthetic they were going for this Thanksgiving. I found it later in the garage, draped in drop cloths, wedged between bins of Christmas ornaments and in used yoga mats. It smelled like dust and paint thinner. My daughter moved around me like I wasn't part of the home, just an obstacle cluttering her holiday aesthetic. Her words were soft, but her actions were hard. "We just want things to look nice this year," she told me, looping a delicate wreath on the front door. "You know how important first impressions are with Dylan's colleagues." Dylan's colleagues. Not my friends. Not family. Just strangers with perfect teeth and cold eyes who'd soon be eating off the china Margaret kept boxed for special occasions. The set with the tiny gold leaves she only took out twice a year, always smiling at me over the rim of her cup. That china had survived 3 decades of marriage, 2 kids, a broken dishwasher, and 1 minor earthquake. But I wasn't sure it would survive Dylan's idea of hospitality. I was still in that house, but nothing in it belonged to me anymore. Not the smell, cinnamon and pine, from candles that gave me headaches. Not the sound, hurting vacuum noise at odd hours, Alexa's voice chirping reminders, podcasts about interior design. Not even the air felt familiar. Too perfumed, too staged. The first floor had been cleared of the things I'd grown with. The books were boxed. The curtains Margaret sewed herself were gone, replaced by sterile, floor-length blinds. Every surface gleamed. It wasn't a home anymore, it was a showroom, a space being curated. And I was not part of the display. Even the guest room, where I slept after my back started complaining about stairs, had been rearranged. My radio was gone. The reading lamp, Margaret's lamp, was replaced by one that looked like a medical device. The sheets were crisp and cold, smelling like lavender detergent I never used. There was a little card on the dresser that read, "Grateful, thankful, blessed." I wanted to laugh, but the sound wouldn't come out. I sat on the edge of the bed that night, my bare feet on the hardwood floor, feeling like a visitor in a hotel that wouldn't let me check in properly. I looked at my hands, browned with time, lined from decades of labor and love, and wondered when exactly they had stopped being useful. I could still change a tire faster than Dylan, fix a leaky faucet in half the time. But none of that mattered here. My tools had been moved to the shed. To make space, they said. I hadn't asked for space. I'd asked for peace. Thanksgiving was always Margaret's time. She'd start prepping weeks in advance, handwritten lists folded neatly in her apron pocket. She'd hum as she stirred cranberry sauce, the same hymn every year, something her mother sang to her back in Mississippi. She used to say gratitude wasn't a holiday, it was a habit. We'd eat with mismatched chairs pulled up to a table too small for our family. her turkey dry and beautiful, and the laughter louder than the heater. Now, it was all different. My daughter wanted private and tasteful. She hired a caterer from Sonoma, told me not to worry about cooking or even setting the table. Just relax, she said. Enjoy yourself. But I didn't feel invited. I felt managed. And then there was Dylan, always circling like he had a clipboard in his hand, like I was another item on a checklist. You all right there, Harold? He'd say every time he passed me in the hall. Never Dad. Never even Mr. Pierce. Just Harold. The way a landlord addresses a tenant whose lease is almost up. That night, I sat in the guest room alone. The hall lights dimmed. I heard them laughing in the living room, my daughter, Dylan, some voices I didn't recognize. The laughter was soft, muted through the walls, but it pierced me all the same. I thought of Margaret again, how she used to squeeze my hand under the table just before dessert, just to say, without saying, that we'd done it, that we'd made a life. I reached for the drawer beside the bed, one they hadn't cleared yet, and pulled it open slowly. Inside, beneath an old Bible and a stack of envelopes, was the photograph I kept hidden from view. Margaret, holding our first grandchild, her face caught in a light that only memory can recreate. Her smile wasn't big, but it was whole. She looked at peace. She looked home. And me? I sat there in the guest room of my own house, the photograph in my lap, and I realized something I didn't want to say out loud. I had become a guest in my life, a placeholder in a space where I once mattered. And worse, they weren't trying to hurt me. Not directly. That might have been easier. This was something colder, something quieter. They were simply clearing the table. And they didn't plan on setting a place for me. Dylan moved through the house like he owned it, though his name wasn't on a single paper I ever signed. His shoes clicked across the floors I refinished by hand, those same boards I sanded down the summer after Margaret passed, just to keep from drowning in the quiet. Now, every time he passed me in the hall, it felt like an audit, like I was a detail someone forgot to erase. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His power came from omission, from the things he didn't say, and the way he looked at me like I was past warranty. Every gesture was coded in that oily sort of politeness that rich folks use when they want to evict you but keep their conscience clean. First, it was little things. They started keeping the thermostat lower, even when the nights dipped into the 40s. I'd get up in the middle of the night, my joints aching, and find the digital numbers glowing colder than comfort. Oh, we're just being environmentally conscious, my daughter said one morning, folding linen napkins at the dining table like we lived in a catalog. The heating bill was outrageous last month. Funny, I hadn't seen a bill in months. Then they rearranged the storage closet off the hallway. Dylan said they were decluttering. But when I went looking for my Veterans Day flag, the one folded into a triangle with Margaret's careful hands, it was gone, replaced by pastel bins labeled seasonal decor in neat white font. I asked about it once. Oh, Dylan said, scratching his chin like it just occurred to him. We boxed up some of your things for safekeeping. They're in the garage somewhere. Somewhere. Like it was all a blur. Like my memories were debris swept into a pile and left for the dustpan. He started referring to Thanksgiving as the event. I overheard him say it on the phone with someone from his firm. Yes, it's a private gathering. Just close colleagues and a few clients. We'll use it to reinforce the brand. The brand. I nearly laughed when I heard that. What brand, exactly? Their relationship? Their sanitized version of family? He never talked to me directly about my place in the house. But his tone, the way he asked me if I needed help up the stairs, or reminded me out of nowhere that there's a great memory care place in town if you ever feel foggy, told me what he was angling toward. He didn't think I belonged in this picture. Not as I was. One afternoon, I found him in the living room, standing at the window with his back to me, talking low on his phone. I mean, he's still sharp enough, he said, but we're trying to create a consistent atmosphere. You know, something more refined. It's hard with legacy occupants. Legacy occupants. He turned and saw me there, standing just inside the archway. Didn't even blink. Just smiled, that thin-lipped smile that always made me think of men who never swung a hammer in their life. "Hey, Harold. Didn't hear you come in. Everything good?" I nodded and walked past him without a word, but I could feel the hole in my chest widening. My daughter wasn't any better. She didn't say much, but when she did, her words were sugar-dusted instructions. "Dad, do you mind using the side bathroom when guests are over?" Or, "Try to avoid leaving dishes in the sink. We're trying to keep the space neutral." Neutral. As if my presence was a loud color ruining the palette. She'd always been precise, even as a child. She used to line up her crayons in color order before she'd draw anything. Margaret would chuckle and say, "She's going to grow into her control," but no one warned me it might grow into coldness, into calculation. Dylan began speaking to her in code. Right in front of me. "We'll need to reset the space before Thursday." Or, "Let's review the plan for after the transition." Transition to what? It didn't take long to realize. They weren't just redecorating. They were preparing to unveil the house as theirs. And I was a detail they hadn't figured out how to politely erase. A week before Thanksgiving, Dylan came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. My old percolator tucked into a corner like a relic from another world. He leaned against the island, arms folded like a man who knew the room was already his. "Hey, Harold," he said, all casual rhythm. "We were thinking, maybe you'd like to take a little break over the holiday. Get out of the house. Somewhere relaxing." I turned the knob on the stove, watching the flame flicker beneath the steel pot. "Break from what?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a change of scenery. There's a place up near Mendocino. Peaceful, clean air. Folks your age love it. We could even book it for you." My hands didn't shake, but something inside me did. "No, thank you," I said, pouring water into the pot. He watched me for a moment, that smile lingering like smoke. Then he said, "I just think it might be good for everyone. There's a lot going on here next week. Wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed. Wouldn't want me to ruin the optics," he meant. That night, I found the pamphlet in the trash. A glossy flyer for a place called Ocean Rest Assisted Living. Freedom to relax. It promised in bold white letters above pictures of old men playing board games and women doing chair yoga in color-coordinated sweats. My name had been written in ink on the top corner. Someone had circled short-term respite care in red. My hands clenched around the edge of the kitchen counter. They weren't just nudging. They were planning. The first real crack in the facade didn't come with shouting or accusations. It came quietly, the way a house settles in the night. Subtle but unmistakable. Something small enough to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But I'd spent a lifetime reading details for what they were, not what people wished them to be. It started with a drawer. The dresser in my room was old oak. Heavy, warm to the touch. The kind of wood Margaret loved because it aged the way people should. Slow, honest, without apology. The bottom left drawer had always been mine. It held the things I didn't put out on shelves anymore. Her watch, wrapped in a soft cloth. The program from her funeral. A letter she wrote me the year our daughter left for college. A tiny tin box that held the first wedding ring we shared before we upgraded to something sturdier. Private things. Sacred things. That drawer had never been empty in 30 years. But that morning, when I slid it open, expecting to see the glint of her silver watch, there was nothing. Just wood. Bare, cold wood. For a moment, I thought maybe I was looking in the wrong drawer. I closed it softly, opened the one above it. T-shirts. Socks. Old glasses case. I opened the next. Photo albums. Papers. Receipts. Normal things. But not her watch. Not her memory. I opened the bottom drawer again. Empty. Too empty. There were faint outlines in the wood. Small rectangles where things had once sat for years. Her watch had left a square shadow. The tin box left an oval. Even the corner where her letter rested had a slight indentation. Now the outlines were ghost marks. Someone had cleared it. Not reorganized. Cleared. I stood there with the drawer pulled out, my fingers resting lightly on the wood. My heart didn't race, but it tightened. That old, familiar tightening I hadn't felt since the day Margaret slipped away from me in that quiet hospital room. Not panic. Just the knowledge that something precious had been taken out of its rightful place. I called out for my daughter. She appeared in the doorway with a wreath in her hands, strands of ribbon hanging like question marks. "Yeah, Dad? Everything okay? Where's your mother's watch?" Her eyes flickered, not long, not dramatically, but wrong. A split second too quick. "Your watch?" she said, adjusting her tone. "You mean that old thing? I thought maybe you misplaced it." I held her gaze. "It sat in this drawer for 3 decades. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers tightened around the wreath. "Dylan thought we should declutter," she said finally. "For the event. Just tidy up personal things. Maybe he moved it. Personal things." I stared at her, and she stepped back as if the air between us had shifted, like she'd said too much and realized it a second too late. "I'll ask him," she said quickly. "I'm sure it's somewhere safe." But there was something in her voice, something brittle, that told me she didn't know where it was. And worse, she didn't care to. After she left, I checked the rest of the room. The closet. The small box where I kept Margaret's old church pins. Even the suitcase under the bed. Nothing. The watch was gone, and not by accident. Then came the second sign. The drawer across the hall, the one in the linen closet, had a new lock. A smooth, silver lock that hadn't been there the week before. I ran my hand across it, feeling its newness. Cool. Untouched by time. Someone had installed it while I was in the backyard trimming the lemon tree. I didn't need to guess who. What linen needed protection? Why now? And from whom? I pressed lightly against the door. Locked. They hadn't even bothered giving me a key. Whatever was inside wasn't towels. Downstairs, I heard Dylan's voice carry through the hallway. Confident. Smooth. The kind of confidence that comes when a man believes he's already won something he hasn't earned. "Just need everything in place before Thursday," he said low, finishing a call. "Once the paperwork's ready, we'll finalize the transfer." She won't question it. My daughter. The woman Margaret raised with gentleness and patience. The girl who once held my hand crossing the street, trusting I'd always keep her safe. Now she was letting a drawer lock me out of my own home. I stepped quietly out of the hallway and made my way to the kitchen, leaning on the counter, grounding myself with the familiar grain of the wood Margaret chose decades ago. I took a breath. Slow, steady. The signs didn't scare me. They clarified things. Something was happening behind walls and late-night whispers. Something involving my belongings, my privacy, and likely my house. Later that afternoon, I pretended to be reading in the living room while listening to their movements. Their steps were too coordinated. Their voices too careful. The sound of tape being pulled. Papers shuffled. Keys exchanged. Not family sounds. Operational sounds. That evening, after they left for errands, I checked the garbage bin outside. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just following instinct. And sure enough, inside the recycling bin was a crumpled envelope with my name on it. My handwriting, torn open. It was an old bank statement I'd been keeping in my desk drawer, one that listed my safe deposit box. The box where I kept the actual deed to the house. The real one, untouched. They had gone through my things. They had searched for something, and they hadn't found it. And that was the first time in weeks that something like calm washed through me. Because if they were looking, it meant they didn't have everything they thought they did. I closed the bin lid and stood there in the cool dusk, the sky turning orange behind the redwoods. Margaret always said the biggest threats never announced themselves. "They walk in quietly, Harry," she'd say. "That's why you've got to listen to what isn't being said." And what wasn't being said now was louder than anything they'd spoken aloud. I walked back inside, through the hallway lined with decorations that weren't mine, past the locked drawer that dared me to forget who the house belonged to, past the guest room where they thought I would shrink quietly into old age. But I felt something rising in me that I hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not yet. Awareness. The drawer wasn't just empty. It was a message. And the lock wasn't just new. It was a warning. They weren't just redecorating. They weren't just preparing for guests. They were preparing for a future where I wasn't in the picture at all. I didn't sleep that night. Not from fear. Fear has a way of shaking a man's hands, and mine were steady as stone. But from a creeping clarity that settled over the house like fog rolling down a hillside. You can't always see the threat inside fog, but you can feel its weight, its intention, its direction. I heard them long before I saw them. The voices carried through the thin hallway walls near midnight. My daughter's tone sharp and whispering, Dylan's lower and firmer. A kind of quiet authority that didn't belong to someone who'd barely known her 5 years. I sat up in the bed, feet on the floor, listening to the small murmurs traveling across the hardwood like ripples on a pond. I had learned to listen for meaning between sounds during my years running the warehouse. Workers lied. Logs didn't. What people said rarely matched what they did. It always came out in the pauses, the shifted weight, the sideways glance. And that's what I heard now, the truth sitting in the silence between their careful words. Needs to be done before the guests arrive, my daughter whispered. I don't want questions, especially not from people who understand paperwork. Paperwork, not decorations, not catering. Paperwork. Dylan answered quietly, but I caught pieces. Insurance, deadline. If he signs anything weird, it could raise flags. Better to finalize before Thanksgiving. My breath stayed even, but my chest tightened. Insurance. Deadline. Sign. I leaned slightly closer toward the cracked door. The hallway light left a faint golden stripe across the floor. Their voices softened again. But then, another phrase hit me like a cold draft under a door. The property transfer, we need his cooperation. Or at least a plausible reason why he's not involved. Plausible reason. My daughter exhaled sharply. He's stubborn. Always has been. Stubborn isn't a problem, Dylan murmured. Old age is. It's paperwork friendly. The floor under my feet seemed to shift. Not from shock, but from recognition. I'd heard men talk like that in the old days, when they wanted something that wasn't theirs. The ones who waited around for a company sale or a retirement check or a death, counting forward to a day no one else saw coming. And there it was, death, not spoken outright, but in the air, in the legal hush of their whispering, in the idea that I was a variable they needed to reduce to zero. I heard movement, the soft press of socked feet. Papers rustled. Someone opened and closed a drawer in the hall I recognized by the squeak. My daughter checking the new locked compartment again, confirming whatever they were hiding was still hidden. Then a louder phrase floated clear as day. The appraiser said the value jumped this year. If we do this now, before the market dips, we can lock in the numbers. Value. Market. Lock in. They weren't talking about a holiday gathering. They were talking about my house. And they were talking about my absence. I sat back against the cold headboard, my jaw tight. I didn't need to hear the rest. Their plan wasn't a storm building, it was already raining. I just hadn't stepped outside yet. The next morning, I tested my theory. I came into the kitchen quietly, earlier than usual. My daughter was already there, wearing her exercise leggings and stirring coffee like she was conducting a meeting. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me standing in the doorway. "Dad?" she said with a brightness that hurt my ears. "You're up early." "Didn't sleep much," I said. "Thought I'd make breakfast." "Oh," she hesitated. "Actually, Dylan wanted to try a new brunch place today. You should rest, okay? We'll bring something back." Rest. Like a man being taken off the schedule. I nodded but made my way to the stove anyway, pouring oats into the pot the way Margaret used to when her hands were still steady. While the water warmed, I glanced at the counter. There it was. A stack of papers, face down, but with the corner of a logo peeking out. The logo of a local title company. One I knew well. Before I reached for it, Dylan walked in. He didn't even say good morning. He just moved the papers aside with one smooth motion, covering them with an autumn-themed towel. "You don't need to worry about those, Harold," he said. "Just some logistics for Thanksgiving." But his hand stayed on the stack an extra second, protecting it. My daughter chimed in from behind, wiping down a perfectly clean counter. "Dad, you remember how much chaos we had last year? This time we're keeping everything organized. Less stress for everyone. Everyone. But whose stress exactly? When they left me to rest, I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the grain of the wood Margaret polished every Sunday. It was smooth, slightly worn at the edges, like a memory you've rubbed so many times it fits your hand. In that quiet, the truth settled fully. They had already counted the house as theirs. Every conversation, every lock, every suggestion, every paper half hidden under towels and books. They were building a plan around my removal. Maybe not violently, maybe not cruelly in their own minds, but certainly efficiently, strategically, coldly. I wasn't a father anymore. I was an obstacle, one they needed to gently tip out of the picture to secure their future. The words I'd overheard circled back to me, letting the old man rest, not the kind of rest you come back from. After they left, I walked down the hallway toward the closet with the new lock. I stood there, listening to the stillness behind the door, imagining documents stacked neatly inside, listing numbers and signatures I hadn't given, calculations of a life boiled down to equity. My life, my home. I placed my palm on the cold metal lock. It was smooth, stiff, and absolutely certain of its purpose. Behind that door wasn't linen. It was proof. Proof of a plan that involved my house, my belongings, and the assumption that I wouldn't be around long enough to protest. And for the first time that week, I felt the faint spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Not rage, not fear, but resolve. Quiet, deliberate resolve. Because if they were planning behind that locked door, I could plan behind another. They didn't ask. They announced. It was 2 days before Thanksgiving. The air was heavy with scented pine and tension, and Dylan stood in the center of the living room like he was delivering a corporate memo. His voice was calm, but the words were anything but. "So, we've decided," he said, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing vaguely toward the hallway. "It's best if you stay in the back room for the holiday, just while the guests are here. It'll keep things simpler, less crowded." I sat on the edge of the couch, the one Margaret and I picked out 15 years ago when our daughter moved to college. Back then, it smelled like new leather and possibility. Now it smelled like lavender cleaner and entitlement. "Which room?" I asked, though I already knew. "The back room," he said again. "The little den. We've set it up nice. Fresh sheets, even a new lamp. It'll be cozy." Cozy. That word again. Like a muzzle wrapped in ribbon. The room he meant was smaller than the shed I used to keep Margaret's gardening tools in. No windows. No airflow. One lamp. A twin bed that creaked when you turned in it. It used to be her sewing room. A space full of light and motion. They'd turned it into a holding cell. My daughter was nearby, fussing with folded napkins that no one had asked her to fold. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Dad, we just want you to be comfortable. You'll have your own space. You don't want to be in the middle of all the noise. Right? The middle. As if I'd somehow drifted to the outskirts of my own family." "And the guest room?" I asked. Dylan smiled, tight, efficient, professional. "That's where our out-of-town friends will be staying. They've already RSVP'd. We've arranged everything." They had rearranged everything, more like. I looked past him at the mantel above the fireplace. Margaret's porcelain angel was missing. The one she set out every November with gentle hands. Always in the same spot, just left of center. In its place was a minimalist sculpture, black, twisted, shapeless. They hadn't just taken my room. They'd taken the season. "We're also trying to keep the atmosphere," my daughter added, still not meeting my eyes. "You know, light, elegant. You can come out and mingle, of course. We're not locking you away. Just don't linger too long in the main rooms. The flow will be important." "The flow." My jaw tightened. "And what exactly is your concern?" I asked. My voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Dylan glanced at my daughter. She gave a half shrug and he pressed on. "Well, it's just that some of the guests are high profile. Potential clients, people from my firm. First impressions matter. And to be honest, you sometimes forget things, Harold. We just don't want anyone uncomfortable." I leaned forward. "Uncomfortable how?" He hesitated for a fraction too long. "You know, if you repeat stories or bring up the past. The past. My life. The years I gave to this home. The birthdays celebrated in this very room. The anniversaries. The late-night talks with my daughter on the staircase when she was 13 and scared of thunderstorms. The way Margaret used to sit by the fire with a novel on her lap and one hand curled around a teacup. Your past, he added, catching himself. It's yours, of course, but people don't always know how to relate. It can make things awkward. My daughter finally turned to face me. Her eyes looked tired, like someone who'd already decided not to be moved. Dad, we're just trying to host something beautiful. Just this once. Let it be about the future, not the past. I looked at them both. For a long time. Then I stood. No need to worry, I said, smoothing the front of my cardigan. I'll stay out of the way. They both exhaled, relieved, mistaking my silence for surrender. But inside, something shifted. Something clicked. Because there's a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't come with shouting. Comes with smiles. With folded napkins and careful phrases and soft exclusions. It comes when your own child rewrites your role from father to furniture, present, but in the background. That afternoon, Dylan handed me a glossy pamphlet. It's just for your information, he said, like a man suggesting a casual cruise. There's a place not far from here, clean, reputable. Just something to think about long-term. The cover showed an elderly man smiling on a garden bench, surrounded by staff in pastel uniforms. The caption read, Golden years, golden care. I handed it back. I've got all the gold I need in the memories you're trying to replace. He didn't get the message. Just nodded slowly, like I was a patient who didn't yet understand his diagnosis. That night, I went into the back room, the one they'd prepared for me. The walls were bare. The closet had no hangers. A box of tissues sat on the dresser, unopened. It was a room built for someone passing through, not someone who belonged. There was a printed itinerary on the nightstand. Thanksgiving 2024. A private gathering. Underneath was a bulleted list of events. Cocktails, catered dinner, toasts, music. Nowhere on it was my name. I wasn't scheduled. I wasn't needed. And in the guest room, I peeked in before bed. There were chocolates on the pillow. A handwritten welcome note from my daughter. So glad you're here, it read, in her script. Not addressed to me. I closed the door softly, stood in the hallway a moment longer. And for the first time in my life, I understood the feeling of being evicted without ever leaving. The next morning, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. A planned quiet, a curated quiet. I stepped into the hallway and smelled something warm and sweet drifting from the kitchen. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a hint of clove. For one hopeful second, I thought of Margaret's pumpkin bread. But it wasn't her recipe. It was the scent of a scented candle, burning in a copper jar on the granite countertop. The label read Rustic Harvest, the kind of artificial fragrance meant to imitate real warmth. It didn't comfort. It replaced. And that's when it settled on me fully. They weren't making a home. They were staging one. From the kitchen, I could hear the faint rustle of decorations being adjusted. My daughter stood on a step stool, fixing a garland along the cabinets. Dylan was beside her, holding a clipboard, yes, an actual clipboard, and nodding with the kind of satisfaction that told me he'd overseen this sort of production before. They both looked up as I entered. Oh, morning, Dad, my daughter said. Her smile was designed, not felt. She climbed down carefully, as though I'd interrupted a rehearsal. We're just checking the final layout. The atmosphere, Dylan added, tapping his list. Good hosting is all about control of the environment. Flow, cohesion, emotional tone. Emotional tone. Not family. Not joy. Tone. I stood there in the doorway, watching them move around the kitchen like choreographers. Every piece of cutlery placed at a measured angle. Every centerpiece aligned to the imaginary grid in Dylan's head. They weren't decorating. They were constructing an image. And the image didn't include me. When they thought I wasn't looking, I saw it happen again. A glance exchanged between them. A small, wordless calculation. She nodded. He moved to the dining table and shifted the seating cards, triangle folded, embossed, elegant. There had been 12 cards earlier. Now there were 11. My stomach didn't drop. My pulse didn't jump. I just felt the air inside me settle into its final shape. Lost a name, I said quietly. My daughter straightened the silverware without turning. Oh, we adjusted the seating. It's more of a business-style dinner anyway. You prefer quieter spaces, don't you, Dad? I didn't answer. Dylan did. We figured, he said without an ounce of hesitation, that you'd be more comfortable taking your meal in the den, or in your room. We'll bring you a plate. You can relax, watch something, avoid the noise, avoid the noise, avoid the guests, avoid the family they were creating without me. The silence that followed wasn't thick. It wasn't loud. It was sharp, clean, the kind that slices quietly. My daughter finally met my eyes, but only for a second, and only with the kind of soft pity people use when they've already made up their minds. Dad, it's not personal. That was the exact moment I understood everything. It was absolutely personal. Not because they hated me. That would have been easier, cleaner. Hatred has edges you can see. This was colder, more polished, more efficient. They didn't hate me. They were done with me. In their partnership, in this new, imported life of curated dinners and corporate gatherings, I had become incompatible. A piece of old furniture that didn't fit the new aesthetic. A loud color in a quiet palette. And they didn't want conflict. They wanted me gone without the mess of a confrontation. The exclusion wasn't just social. It was strategic. My daughter's eyes kept drifting. Toward the hallway, toward the locked drawer, toward everything they thought they'd kept hidden. Toward the future they were preparing, one where my signature wasn't needed because they already had something else lined up. Something whispered through the room, though neither of them said it. This house will last longer than you. I see, was all I said. A simple sentence. But inside me, something shifted like a safe door clicking shut. Dylan cleared his throat. We just want everyone to be comfortable, Harold. It's better if the atmosphere is consistent. You know how easily things can get disrupted. Disrupted. By me. By my existence. My daughter stepped closer, reaching out as if to soften the blow, but her hand hovered in the air. Suspended, unsure. A gesture meant to comfort but landing as something else entirely. Permission-seeking. A daughter checking her fiancé's face before touching her own father. I stepped back before her hand met my shoulder. I said I see, I repeated. And I did. All of it. The whispering. The rearranging. The exclusion from rooms, from decisions, from the table. The locked drawer. The missing watch. The financial papers hidden under towels. The talk of flow, transition, stability, care. This wasn't family conflict. This was a plan. A plan to transition me out of my own home without getting their hands dirty. A plan where my presence had become an inconvenience. They handled quietly, politely, behind smiles and scented candles. A plan where my disappearance, temporary or permanent, fit neatly into their schedule. The realization sat deep, but not like a wound. More like a truth I'd been circling around for weeks, finally stepping into its center. I wasn't losing a family. I was being replaced by one. And they thought I'd go quietly. They thought I'd nod, step aside, let the flow continue. But they had forgotten something about me. Something Margaret never forgot. I wasn't a man who raised his voice. I was a man who noticed things. And once I saw a thing clearly, I acted. Quietly, precisely, irreversibly. That night I didn't speak. Not out of protest. Not even from hurt. I simply had no words left to offer a house that no longer listened. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room they assigned to me. Once Margaret's sewing room, now emptied of thread and fabric and filled with the sound of someone being slowly erased. The overhead light was harsh. It buzzed faintly, as if unsure whether it was meant to be on. I didn't turn it off. I just sat there. My slippers were still missing. My Bible had been moved. The lamp on the nightstand wasn't mine. It was too modern, too bright, too much like the rest of the house. Everything in that room was neutral, sterile, devoid of history. It felt like a space designed for someone not expected to stay long. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, fingers laced together. My wedding ring was still on my left hand. Faded, worn thin, a perfect circle holding everything I had ever promised. I turned it slowly with my thumb, like a habit I'd picked up back when Margaret used to sit beside me humming and the world still felt right. In the hallway, I could hear them laughing. Not cruelly, just comfortably. That was worse. Laughter not made in malice, but in absence. They didn't miss me. They didn't wonder where I was. They had filled the house with something else. New sounds, new routines, new life. And I was the ghost who hadn't realized he'd already been buried. I glanced at the wall where Margaret's fabric rack used to hang. She kept her patterns pinned neatly, her favorite scissors resting on the shelf below. Gone. All of it. The wall was painted over now. Pale gray, the kind that photographs well. I closed my eyes and saw her, not in grief, not in pain, but laughing. Hair pinned up, reading glasses hanging around her neck, a pincushion on her wrist as she cut patterns for our granddaughter's Easter dress. The radio played an old jazz tune, something mellow and offbeat. She'd move with the music, hips swaying slightly, unaware of how completely she filled the room with life. I kept my eyes closed and let the memory run. I could feel it in my chest, the warmth of her presence, the way she made even silence feel full. I could almost smell the starch she used on the fabric. Almost. Then a door closed somewhere down the hall. Quick, not slammed, just decisive. The memory slipped, and all that remained was the buzz of the light above and the quiet realization that the house no longer remembered her either. They'd painted over her, packed her into boxes, replaced her table with something from a catalog. They didn't ask what she would have wanted. They didn't even ask what I wanted, because they didn't care. And that finally deeply cut. I had spent a lifetime holding my family together. Even when Margaret was alive, I was the one who wrote the checks, fixed the pipes, negotiated truancy with the school when our daughter skipped class to drive to the beach. I stayed up at night to make sure doors were locked, stoves were off, tears were soothed. I wasn't perfect, but I was present. Now all that work had been rendered invisible, not because I failed, but because I no longer fit the narrative. There was no place at the table for quiet men with steady hands and memories that didn't match the decor. I reached for the drawer beside the bed, the only space they hadn't locked, boxed, or reassigned. Inside was a photo of Margaret and me from our 40th anniversary. She wore the blue dress I liked, the one with the loose sleeves and the soft collar. We were at the lake. Her hand was on my chest. I pulled it out and stared at it until the edges of the picture blurred. And that's when it hit me. Not with noise, not with tears, but with that cold, calm feeling you only get when everything finally makes sense. I hadn't lost my daughter. I'd lost the version of her that knew me. The woman in this house was not the child Margaret and I raised. She was a new model, polished, corporate, efficient. A woman who measured love in lines of inheritance and saw aging not as wisdom but as liability. And Dylan, he was never family. He was the architect of this new world. One where legacy meant square footage, not shared meals. One where fathers were not honored but archived. I rested the photograph gently on the nightstand and looked around the room again. And I told myself the truth. This isn't my home anymore. These aren't my people. I am not confused. I am not weak. I am not a burden. I am a man who built a life. And I am watching that life be slowly, politely stolen. But I will not protest. Not yet, because protest is noise. And noise is easy to dismiss. But silence sharpens. It listens. It sees. And mine was just beginning. It started with silence. Not just mine, but theirs. Silence is a strange teacher. It shows you who people become when they think you're no longer looking. Or worse, no longer capable of understanding. So I gave them what they wanted. I let my eyes linger a little longer in confusion when they spoke. I shuffled a bit slower to the kitchen. I asked them to repeat themselves now and then, just enough to paint the picture they were already halfway through sketching. The picture of an old man losing grip. A man harmless enough to ignore, weak enough to sideline. I became background noise in my own house. And it worked. The more I drifted into their margins, the bolder they became. Whispers turned to conversations. Closed doors stayed open a crack too wide. They assumed I wouldn't question what I heard, wouldn't understand the stakes. They assumed wrong. Dylan began working from home more often. He'd sit in the dining room with his laptop, spreadsheets open, Zoom calls humming from behind noise-canceling headphones. But every now and then, he'd forget to mute. And I'd hear bits. Words like executor, transfer, end of life, real property. Meanwhile, my daughter stayed busy with lists. She carried around a soft leather notebook, tan, expensive-looking, the kind Margaret would have called a vanity item. I once caught her on the back porch writing something in it. She didn't notice me standing at the window. She wrote my name. Then she underlined it. Twice. That afternoon, I returned to the guest room they once graciously allowed me to inhabit. My hands moved slowly, not out of fatigue, but with care. Precision. I opened the small bedside drawer. It was still unlocked. Still unnoticed. Inside was a false bottom. Something I'd added years ago when Margaret asked me to keep her mother's old rings safe. She never trusted safes. Said they made people lazy. If something matters, she said, hide it somewhere human hands have to remember. Beneath the panel was a small leather pouch. Inside, folded carefully, were two items. The first, a laminated copy of my durable power of attorney, signed, witnessed, and filed with the county. The second, a USB drive. I plugged it into my old laptop, the one Dylan once called a relic. That relic still ran just fine. It had no apps, no Bluetooth, but it had clarity. And clarity is what I needed. Over the last year, I'd been scanning everything: bank statements, the house deed, Margaret's will, the medical documents that named me as my own guardian, not my daughter. I had it all, digital and dated. They didn't know I'd done it. They thought I was still keeping everything in paper folders in the hallway closet, where Dylan had once asked to help me organize. I let him, and I let him think I never noticed the missing documents afterward. From that day on, I doubled everything. That USB drive was my memory, locked in plastic. But my real leverage was still in the bank. A small, square key, taped behind the baseboard heater in the laundry room, where only someone who cleaned their own floors would think to look. The key to my safe deposit box, where the original deed sat, where Margaret's real will rested, untouched. The one that said this house passed to me, then to my grandchildren, not through my daughter's discretion, but through a trust she couldn't touch without my death certificate. I had kept that secret out of respect, out of family unity, out of a hope that love would be enough. Now it was insurance. That night, I replayed every interaction I'd had with them over the past month. The way Dylan moved around me, never speaking unless necessary. The way my daughter called me Dad with less warmth and more function. The way the house smelled not of family but of staging. And I knew they had made me into a concept, not a man. A concept that needed clearing. The next day, while they were out running errands, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove. I took the old truck, my 1989 Chevy, the one Margaret teased me about keeping as a museum piece. I had kept it in the garage under a tarp, convinced someday I'd need it again. I changed the oil last spring out of habit. Thank God for habits. I drove across town to Mrs. Carter's place. My neighbor, our friend for 20 years. She still called me Mr. Pierce, out of respect for Margaret. She was surprised to see me. Everything all right, Harold? I nodded. I just need a witness. She stepped inside without hesitation. Together, we printed out a fresh copy of my will. I updated the addendum, revoked any previous power of attorney, and listed two trusted witnesses, Mrs. Carter and her niece, a notary. We signed it all. Then I gave Mrs. Carter a small envelope. If anything happens to me suddenly, I said, open this. Not before, but right away if I go silent. She didn't ask questions. She knew the look in my eyes. She'd buried a husband too. She knew when silence meant more than peace. Back at home, I placed another copy of the revised will in the unlocked drawer. I wanted them to find it, or at least think they had, because the real one, sealed, notarized, and filed, was now in 3 places. And none of them were this house. That night, I sat in the living room while Dylan rehearsed a toast for Thanksgiving. He thought I was asleep in the sewing room. My daughter laughed from the kitchen, sipping wine from one of the glasses I bought for our 25th anniversary. She had no idea the next few days would change the way she looked at me forever. They thought I was slow. They thought I was blind. They thought the old man was already gone. But I was still here, and I was watching, and I was ready. I didn't expect much when I flipped open the old phone. I'd kept it buried in my sock drawer, one of the few places Dylan hadn't deemed necessary to organize. It was a flip model, black plastic, scratched, and too slow to handle more than calls and simple messages. The kind of device you'd overlook in a world full of smart technology. But overlooked is exactly what I needed. I pressed the button and let it buzz to life. It blinked through a few missed updates, then settled on the home screen. 1 missed call. 1 voicemail. The timestamp read, November 18th. 3 days ago. The number belonged to Mrs. Carter. I pressed play and leaned in. Mr. Pierce? Her voice came through crackly but clear. I didn't want to bother you, but I saw something last night I thought you should know. There were 2 men outside your property line taking pictures. Flash photography. Around the side yard near the big tree and back gate. About midnight, maybe later. I called out to them, but they ran off. One of them dropped something, but I couldn't see what. Figured you'd want to know. Call me back when you can. I sat back slowly. Midnight. That back gate was the one I built myself in 1986, the year we redid the fence line. Margaret called it your quiet project. I'd spent a week out there digging post holes by hand, carving the gate's crossbeam with our initials. No one used it anymore. Not since we stopped gardening. Not since. And then I realized. That's where the property line ran wide, where the surveyor had made a note in the original deed about disputed boundaries with the vacant lot next door. The vacant lot now owned by a shell company Dylan had casually mentioned a few weeks back. I hadn't thought much of it then, just some small talk about development. He said something about cleaning up the neighborhood. Now it felt more like mapping. Why would someone photograph the far edge of my property? Why at night? I stood up, grabbed my coat, and stepped out the back door. The air was colder than I expected. Damp. Heavy with that November stillness that settles over Northern California just before the rains begin. I followed the path through the side yard, past the lemon tree, past the old compost bin I never had the heart to throw out. The gate creaked when I opened it. Still solid. Still mine. I stepped beyond the fence line and scanned the area with my flashlight. The leaves crunched underfoot. Then I saw it, a small glint near the base of the tree. I knelt slowly, knees stiff, and picked it up. A flash drive. Black. Scuffed. No label. I held it in my hand like something alive. Back inside, I plugged it into the old laptop. It took a moment, then opened to a folder named simply Assessment. Inside were photographs. Over 100 of them. My house front, back side, roofline. Windows marked with tape. Notes scribbled on a scanned notepad. Foundation sound. Possible easement. Verify title condition. Owner elderly, resistance unlikely. Resistance. Unlikely. Another folder labeled strategy held scanned documents. Copies of legal forms I hadn't seen before. Transfer agreements. Quitclaim deeds. Letters addressed to a name I didn't recognize. Greenwood Holdings. And then I saw it. My name forged on one of the forms. Sloppy, but close enough. If someone weren't paying attention, it would pass. There it was. Proof. Not suspicion. Not interpretation. Proof. They were preparing to sell. Not just the house, but the land. All of it. Behind my back. Using a company that didn't legally trace back to either of them. And they had already taken pictures for the appraiser. Or the developer. Or whoever was waiting on the other end of the sale. I stared at the screen until the lines blurred. Then I printed every page, every note, every photo. I slid the copies into a large manila folder and tucked it inside the vent under the hallway bookshelf. I'd built that bookshelf myself in 1993, never imagining it would one day serve as my last line of defense. The next morning, I called Mrs. Carter. "Did they come back?" I asked. She hesitated. "They drove by last night. Slower this time. Same car. Didn't get out." I thanked her. I didn't explain. She didn't ask. Sometimes allies don't need the whole story. Just a reason to believe in yours. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table while Dylan cooked. Yes, cooked. He'd been doing more of that lately. Trying to prove, perhaps, that he could host. That he could own this. My daughter breezed in holding her phone. "Oh," she said. "Dad, Dylan's cousin is bringing someone. We might need to shift the table setting again." Dylan looked up from the stove. "We'll need more wine." "I'll make a list," she said. "Do you still have your Costco card, Dad?" I smiled. "No, I let it expire." Dylan chuckled. "Guess we'll upgrade that too." They laughed. I didn't, because in my pocket that flash drive still warmed my hand. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't quite seen before. Not just that they were prepared to erase me, but that they had already rehearsed it. They thought they'd won. They thought the house was theirs. They thought I'd wither. But I wasn't a man holding onto the past. I was a man holding receipts. The time for observation was over. I moved carefully, not quickly. There's a difference. Quickness invites attention. Carefulness wears the face of routine. I'd spent my life balancing ledgers, managing warehouse inventories, and memorizing mechanical layouts before computers took over the thinking. I knew how to do things precisely, with purpose, and without leaving noise behind. On the surface, nothing changed. I still nodded when my daughter passed in the hallway, still shuffled to the kitchen with my coffee mug at 7:15 a.m. sharp, still sat by the window for my morning light, as they called it, watching the backyard as if it still gave me peace. But inside, I turned every hour into a task, a checklist. Every moment of calm became another brick in the wall I was quietly building between myself and their plans. It began with the accounts. Years ago, Margaret and I kept our finances simple: joint savings, a modest checking account, and a few CDs we rolled over every 5 years. But after her passing, I diversified. Not to chase gains, but to create distance. I opened 2 separate accounts under my name alone, one local, one out of state, both listed with a contact address at a small post office box I kept from when I used to volunteer with the Veterans Association. I checked them both. Balances, untouched. Then I reviewed the activity on our original joint account, the one Dylan had helped me consolidate shortly after he moved in. Several wire attempts. 2 of them flagged as incomplete. Reason: missing authorization. That's where my stamp had once come into play. My signature stamp, the one Dylan claimed I should use for convenience when we handled bills together. The one I allowed him to keep in the drawer by the office printer. That stamp was now gone. But I knew he'd been using it. Forgery wasn't their first play, it was their assumption of access. They didn't think I'd notice, or if I did, that I'd forget. And the truth is, I might have, had I not kept one thing separate all along: Margaret's real will. I retrieved it from my safe deposit box that afternoon. It was still there, untouched in its waterproof envelope, notarized, filed under my name, listing me as sole executor and trustee of our estate, with a secondary provision, one I'd nearly forgotten about. Clause 14C. In the event of undue influence, coercion, or attempted manipulation of property prior to the trustee's passing, all rights of inheritance revert to the grandchildren directly, bypassing intervening parties. It had been Margaret's idea. "Just in case," she said once. "Our daughter forgets herself." I brought that will home with me in a padded folder. I didn't show it to anyone. Not yet. But I copied it 3 times. One for Mrs. Carter, one for the attorney I contacted in town, and one to keep on me, folded and flat against my chest, inside the pocket of Margaret's old cardigan. I began documenting the house. Not just the obvious things, the missing watch, the rekeyed doors, the moving of my belongings, but the subtle changes. I took photos of every room. The replaced furniture, the new art, the reorganized closets. I opened drawers and photographed their contents. Menus, wine inventories, purchase orders for rental items labeled under Dylan's LLC. They had turned my home into an asset. Product for presentation. Even the pantry had been curated. No more instant grits, no more Margaret's tea bags. Everything labeled, glass jars, coordinated shelves. It looked beautiful. It looked hollow. I didn't confront them. Confrontation was noise, and noise would only drive them deeper into secrecy. Instead, I kept playing the fool. I asked them to explain simple things, when the trash went out, how the thermostat worked, whether we needed more salt. Dylan smiled patiently. My daughter touched my arm with practiced pity. Every time they assumed I was fading, they lowered their guard further. One afternoon, Dylan left his laptop open. I passed by as he walked into the kitchen. On the screen was an email thread. Subject line, transfer completion timeline. The chain included his cousin, the one supposedly visiting for the holidays, and someone named R. Edison, ESQ. I didn't click anything. Didn't need to. I noted the address. Later, I looked up the name. Real estate law, based out of Marin, specializing in probate disputes and power of attorney claims. I printed the email header from the browser's cache using the old desktop in the garage, where Dylan forgot to clear the browser history. I added it to the folder. Next came the final step, the stamp. He thought I didn't notice it was gone, but I'd kept the original. The one he had was a replica ordered online, slightly off in font, but good enough to pass a quick glance. The original was tucked inside a hollowed-out volume of Margaret's favorite book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She kept it by the bedside for years. I never told anyone I turned it into a safe after she died. The idea made me smile once. Now it saved me. I removed the original stamp, wrapped it in cloth, and took it to the attorney I'd contacted the week before. An older gentleman who handled estate matters quietly and had no office sign. He agreed to notarize the authentication of my real stamp and register it with the county as the only valid version. I also revoked all previous financial permissions, including any granted to my daughter. And then I waited. I didn't tell them I'd done any of it. I let them keep thinking they were one signature away. Let them practice their speeches, plan their seating, and finalize their menu. Let them move through the house as though I was already gone. Because what they didn't realize was that every move they made was being countered. Not with anger, not with threats, but with documents, photographs, time-stamped evidence, witnesses, and truth. Truth is a slow knife. It doesn't slash, peels. And I had started peeling away every false layer they'd laid over my life. Quietly, deliberately, irreversibly. It happened on November 22nd, the day before Thanksgiving, the day they called finalization day when they thought I wasn't listening. I knew the moment was near by the rhythm of the house. Dylan was up early, pacing the hallway with his phone pressed tight to his ear, whispering in clipped phrases. My daughter hummed as she moved through the kitchen, laying out fine china on the dining table. Every movement was too precise, too rehearsed. They weren't setting a table. They were preparing a stage. Mid-morning, Dylan knocked softly on my door. He entered with a kind of artificial cheer I'd come to recognize in him. A man delivering lines he'd practiced in a mirror. "Hey, Harold," he said. "Just going through some holiday prep. Quick thing. Mind stepping into the office with us for a sec? Just a small signature thing. Nothing major." I gave him a gentle nod. Let him think it was working. The office was warm, bright, almost too bright. They'd opened the curtains wide, as if daylight could legitimize what they were about to do. My daughter was already seated, flipping through a stack of papers. "Dad," she said, "we just need you to sign a quick confirmation. Just something for the records. In case of emergencies." She smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, just efficiently. Dylan slid the top page toward me. I didn't look at it right away. I looked at him. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Then I looked at her. Her eyes didn't quite meet mine. I picked up the pen they offered, slick, expensive, and held it over the signature line. My name was typed beneath it, clean font, legal spacing, but I didn't sign. I turned the page over slowly, like I was confused. "What's this about?" I asked. "Oh," Dylan said quickly. "Just confirming that you're allowing us to manage some things for you, household logistics, you know. Paperwork's just a formality." I let the silence stretch. Then I set the pen down. "You already forged this once," I said. They froze. The air in the room changed. Not loudly, just decisively. My daughter blinked. "What are you talking about?" I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and unfolded a printed document. I placed it beside the one on the table. Same layout, same font, different date. A signature in my name, shaky, unfamiliar, and very much not mine. "This," I said, tapping the forged copy, "was submitted to a title firm in Marin under the assumption I wouldn't notice." Dylan tried to speak, but I held up a second document. A printout of the email header I'd taken from his laptop. "This," I continued, "was your communication with a probate attorney. You referred to me as non-compos mentis, unfit to handle my affairs." My daughter opened her mouth, but no sound came. I pulled a third document from the folder. Margaret's real will. "This," I said, voice steady, "is the only legal will in existence. Signed, notarized, and filed before any of this started. It names me sole trustee and protects the property from exactly the kind of manipulation you've been planning." Dylan stepped forward. "Harold, look, there's been a huge misunderstanding." I raised my hand. "There's no misunderstanding. There's intent. There's strategy. There's execution. What there isn't, what there never was, is honesty." My daughter's voice cracked. "We were trying to protect you." "From what?" I asked. "My own name? My own home." She swallowed hard. "You weren't present. You seemed distant, tired. We thought—" "No," I said softly. "You hoped I wouldn't fight back." Dylan tried to gather himself. "Look, none of this has been filed. We were just preparing for contingencies, worst-case scenarios. There's no harm in preparing documents." I picked up the stack they'd asked me to sign, examined the final page. There it was, a transfer of power of attorney, pre-filled quitclaim deed, a consent form to assign rights to the LLC registered under Greenwood Holdings. I tore it in half, then in half again. I dropped the pieces on the desk. "I've revoked all shared access to our accounts," I said. "The stamp you've been using is fraudulent. The county has been notified. And everything you've done, every photo, every email, every document, is now in the hands of a legal advisor." My daughter sat down, as if the gravity finally settled on her shoulders. Dylan was still posturing, still trying to speak, but there was nothing left to say. "Tomorrow," I said, "your gathering can go on. Host whoever you like. Smile however you need to. But you will not do it with anything that belongs to me." I stepped out of the office, walked down the hallway, past the mirror near the front door, and for the first time in years, I saw myself not as they painted me. Frail, absent, finished, but as I truly was, steady, sharp, present. That was my first blow. Not loud, but loud enough to echo through everything they thought they had secured. It's a peculiar thing, strength. Folks assume it's in the arms or the chest, or in a loud voice raised high enough to make people back down. But real strength is quiet. It sits inside a man, deep and unmoving, until the moment comes when silence is no longer a shield, but a mirror. After I walked out of that office, I didn't go to my room. I went to the backyard. Same spot where I used to prune Margaret's roses. The rose beds were gone now, replaced by gravel and a wrought iron bench Dylan had found at some estate sale. I sat on that cold bench, folded my hands, and breathed, not to calm myself, but to listen. I could hear them inside. My daughter pacing, her voice low and sharp, Dylan's tone rising and falling, trying to seize control of a ship he never truly captained. They were floundering, spinning. The documents they had so carefully prepared, voided. The plans they'd choreographed, exposed. And the old man they believed would fade, had just declared the truth. It was the first time in a long while I felt the shape of my own presence again. Felt it settle on my shoulders, not like a burden, but like a coat I'd forgotten I still owned. I wasn't angry. I thought maybe I would be, but instead I felt calm, clear. I watched a bird land on the edge of the dried fountain. One we hadn't run since Margaret's final spring. It dipped its beak, then darted off. Tiny motion, unbothered, present. I stood slowly, knees popping the way they always did. Walked the perimeter of the yard. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, each step deliberate. I had spent the last few weeks letting them erase me, letting them talk around me, about me, for me. And I'd waited, not because I was weak, because I was watching. And now that I had shown them the truth, I didn't need to prove it again. Let them scramble. Let them patch over the cracks with excuses. Let them spin their story. The house didn't belong to them. Not legally. Not spiritually. It was mine. Mine and Margaret's. Built over 30 years, one memory at a time. Every coat of paint. Every creak in the floor. Every holiday roast and backyard barbecue and midnight laugh. Etched into the beams. And in their scramble to own it, they'd shown their hand. They'd shown how little of it they understood. Later that afternoon, I returned to the kitchen for a glass of water. My daughter stood there, rearranging wine glasses on a tray, her movements clipped and distracted. She didn't speak at first. When she finally did, it was in a quiet voice. "Dad, I didn't mean for it to go like this." I nodded, not in agreement, just to acknowledge the sound. She kept moving glasses. "We just thought you'd want less to worry about." I looked at her. She couldn't meet my eyes. "You thought I wouldn't notice," I said. "And if I did, you thought I wouldn't care." She put the last glass down. Her hand trembled just enough for me to see it. I stepped closer, not to threaten, but to speak as a father again. One last time. "There is nothing in this house I didn't earn. Nothing I don't remember building, fixing, or cleaning with my own hands. Including you." Her eyes welled. But I didn't give her room to cry. I wasn't interested in tears anymore. "You let someone convince you that comfort was more important than truth. That quiet meant consent. And that the old man could be shifted aside like a piece of furniture." "I'm sorry," she said softly. I believed her. But sorry doesn't undo intention. "I'm not here to fight you," I told her. "I'm not here to embarrass you in front of your guests. I'm not even here to win." She blinked. "Then what are you here for?" I looked around the kitchen, still filled with the smells of preparation, the quiet hum of appliances, the faint trace of Margaret's last Thanksgiving lingering in my memory like perfume. "I'm here," I said, "because this house still has a heartbeat, and it won't stop just because you changed the wallpaper." She didn't respond. She stepped aside, and that was enough. That night I sat alone in the den. Not the sewing room they pushed me into, but the actual den. My space. I made tea. The old way. Margaret's way. One bag. No sugar. No frills. I sipped slowly. The walls around me, painted over, redecorated, sanitized, still held her laughter. Still remembered me. And I knew I hadn't reclaimed the house. I'd reclaimed myself. No shouting. No eviction. Just truth. And truth, once spoken, doesn't go back into hiding. Thanksgiving morning came dressed in sunlight, but the air inside that house had turned cold. Not the kind of cold you feel on your skin, but in the way people speak to each other when they're unsure where the floor ends. I was up early. Old habit. The kettle whistled at 6:45, and I took my tea to the front porch, wrapped in the cardigan Margaret always left by the door for cool mornings like this. From my chair, I watched the fog roll off the hills like it had every Thanksgiving for 3 decades. It was a stillness that used to mean peace. Now it meant readiness. Inside, I could hear movement. My daughter whispering sharply, Dylan's voice lower than usual. Cabinet doors opening and closing. Fast steps. The clatter of silverware being reset. Panic comes slow to people who think they're in control. But once it arrives, it multiplies. By 8 a.m., I saw Dylan through the front window. He was at the dining room table, holding a stack of papers. He flipped through them fast, lips pressed thin, head shaking slightly. He stood, went to the hallway closet, came back empty. Looked again under the credenza. Something wasn't matching. Good. A few minutes later, I watched my daughter make the same loop. Kitchen, office, hallway. She opened a drawer I hadn't seen her use in months. Then another. Her movements were quick, nervous. The performance they'd curated was cracking. They didn't know what was missing yet. Only that something had changed. By 9:15, they were in the office together. The door wasn't closed all the way. I heard fragments. He moved it. Are you sure you didn't scan it? It's not in the folder, Sarah. It was there 2 days ago. Their voices weren't angry. They were tight, controlled. Controlled fear is still fear. When I stepped into the hallway, they both looked up like teenagers caught sneaking in late. My daughter tried to smile. Morning, Dad. Want to help us with the table? I set that table every year for 30 years, I said. But today I think I'll just watch. She nodded too quickly. Dylan stayed seated, but his eyes tracked me like I was a threat now, not a relic. Good. I went to the living room, sat in my chair. Not the one they'd pushed into the corner. My chair. The one they'd tried to move out to open up the space. I had quietly returned it after they'd gone to bed last night. At 10 o'clock, guests began to arrive. They came with wine bottles and layered desserts and polite smiles. Family, friends, business contacts, a couple of Dylan's people I didn't know. The house filled with voices and the warmth of bodies moving around each other. But the hosts weren't glowing. They were watching the door, checking their phones, whispering to each other behind the island counter. I saw Dylan pull my daughter aside. He handed her something in a white envelope. She took it reluctantly, slipped it under a stack of napkins on the sideboard. Took them a while to realize I'd been watching the whole time. I stayed seated, sipped my tea, said nothing, let them feel it. The unraveling. Dylan made a few rounds through the guests, smiled too wide, made his voice louder than necessary. He was trying to reclaim authority. But you can't lead a room when your foundation is cracking under your feet. At 11:15, I stood and walked to the hallway, my steps slow, quiet. I opened the drawer beside the guest bathroom, just far enough for the envelope I'd placed there last night to shift toward the front. Inside it was a printed copy of the forged documents, labeled in red marker. Fraudulent, not valid. Beneath it, a letter addressed to an attorney I had retained the week before. Dated, signed, and accompanied by the notice of revocation of any prior powers of attorney. I didn't take it out. I just made sure it was visible. And I left the drawer open a crack. Let them find it. Let them wonder how much I knew. Let them guess how long I'd been steps ahead. When I walked back into the main room, I felt it. Their eyes were following me now. Not with affection. Not even with annoyance. With worry. Real, tangible worry. The kind that grows in the space between guilt and consequence. My daughter approached as I settled back into my chair. Her voice was soft. Dad, did you move something from the office? I move a lot of things, I said. Usually when they're put where they don't belong. She hesitated. We were just making sure the paperwork was all in order. Whose order? I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back into the kitchen, told Dylan something too low for me to hear. He turned, looked at me, and for the first time since this all began, I saw something behind his eyes, uncertainty. He no longer controlled the game. The guests laughed and chatted, oblivious. They were praising the roasted root vegetables, complimenting the wine selection, admiring the place settings. But Dylan and my daughter? They were unraveling, because they'd finally realized the old man wasn't asleep. He was awake, watching, prepared. And the house they tried to build on deception had started to rot at its foundation. By early afternoon, the house looked perfect on the surface. Every centerpiece aligned, every dish placed just right, guests laughing in low, pleasant waves. But under that layer of civility, something was tightening. The kind of tension you don't see in posture or tone, but in the stillness between breaths. They were waiting for something. Not someone. Something. And they didn't know it was already here. At 2:04 p.m., my daughter came to me holding a silver tray with 2 glasses of cider. Her hands were too steady, her smile too precise. It was the same face she wore during her high school plays. Perfectly rehearsed, slightly too bright. She offered me a glass and sat on the ottoman across from my chair. "Dad," she said, "there's something I need to show you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Not the thick legal kind, this was creased, printed from a home printer already smudged from fingers pressing too hard. She unfolded it slowly, set it on the coffee table. I didn't lean forward. She tapped it. "It's just a contingency form. Something Dylan drafted in case. Well, in case something ever happened and we needed to act quickly." I said nothing. She kept going. "It doesn't change anything about how we feel. It makes transitions easier. There's no harm in signing it. You're still in control. We just want to make sure the house is safe." Safe. There was that word again. She was talking about them, not me. I picked up the paper, held it between my fingers like something fragile. It was warm from her hand. The kind of warmth that lingers when someone's hiding a cold truth behind it. "Who drafted this?" I asked. She hesitated. "Dylan. But he had it reviewed." "By who?" "A friend. Not anyone formal yet." I folded the paper once, sharply, then again, placed it beside the cider. "Your friend's going to have a hard time explaining a forged signature to the county clerk," I said. Her lips parted, but no words came. "You left the forged deed in my drawer. The one labeled transfer draft. You forgot to delete the metadata, too." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small slip, a printout from my old laptop. I placed it gently on the folded form. It showed the date the document was created. "Not by me. You didn't think I knew what metadata was." Her face dropped, and in that moment the performance ended. The mask cracked, not shattered but lowered, just enough to show the tiredness underneath. The guilt, the fear. "Dad?" Her voice faltered. "We didn't want to hurt you." I looked at her. Not through her. "You didn't think I could fight." She swallowed hard. "No, I didn't think you'd care." There it was. The truth she hadn't meant to say. I leaned forward for the first time. "I buried your mother 2 years ago. I packed her clothes, boxed her sewing machine, folded the blankets she knitted by hand for every grandchild in this family. I washed the sheets after hospice left. Alone. And you think I don't care?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. "You replaced our wedding photo with abstract art," I said, voice low but sharp. "You threw out her teacups. You moved me into a guest room in my own house. And you think not caring would have made this easier." From the hallway, footsteps approached. Dylan entered, trying to mask his concern with a smile. "Hey, Harold. Everything good in here?" I didn't look at him. "Open the drawer," I said. He blinked. "What?" "The side table in the guest bathroom." He hesitated. "Why?" "You'll see." He looked to my daughter. She nodded. He walked off. The silence stretched until I heard the drawer open. Then nothing. Just air. Then the sound of him returning, faster this time. In his hand, the envelope. He looked at me, looked at her, then slowly opened it. Out came the forged documents, the letter to the attorney, and a note, handwritten. "If you're reading this, it's already too late." He set it down like it burned. He began. "You never asked me," I said. "You assumed. You plotted. You counted on my silence." My daughter wiped her cheek. "What happens now?" "You mean legally?" I asked. They both nodded. "Nothing yet," I said. "That's the gift I'm giving you today." Dylan shifted. Meaning you still have time to back away from this, to undo what you can, to accept that this house is not yours. Not yet, and maybe not ever. He opened his mouth again. I raised a hand. "No more lies," I said. "No more strategies. No more dinners behind my back with attorneys pretending to be friends. You want to eat in this house today, you sit at the table as family. not as predators. My daughter looked at me, truly looked. "I don't know how we got here," she whispered. I did. They stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a step in their plan. I stood slowly. My knees ached, but I straightened all the way. Looked down at the table, at the folded document, at the printout, at the envelope with their worst selves laid bare. "I won't throw you out," I said, "but I'll never forget this." I left them there. In the room they tried to control. In the house they tried to steal. Watching the man they thought was powerless walk away with every inch of power still intact. It was subtle at first. They didn't scream or slam doors. That would have been too honest for people who spent so much time crafting appearances. No, the panic came like a slow leak in a ceiling. Quiet at first, then spreading fast once the first drop fell. By the time the guests sat down to eat, the performance had cracked. Dylan moved stiffly between the kitchen and the table, offering second servings with a hand that twitched just slightly as he poured. His tone was polite, measured, but his eyes were sharp, scanning each room like a man expecting to be cornered. My daughter had retreated into brittle smiles and awkward laughter. She sat at the head of the table, my place, gripping the silverware like it anchored her. When the guests complimented the stuffing or asked about the wine, she answered too quickly, too brightly, her voice high and thin like a snapped violin string. They were unraveling, and no one else could see it but me. That's the thing about panic. It's invisible until you know where to look. The house was full of bodies, chatter rising and falling, but underneath it all was a low vibration, like a tension wire pulled too tight. I stayed mostly silent, ate a little, sipped my water, watched. Dylan avoided my gaze. Even when he addressed the table, he never looked my way. He was counting minutes, waiting for something, hoping something would come that might undo the shift I had forced. But it wouldn't, because the truth was already out, and no amount of pie or pleasantries could rewind it. At one point, I stood and walked to the den, no announcement, no excuse, just left. I heard my daughter say something behind me, lighthearted, a joke about Dad needing to stretch his legs, but her voice broke on the last word. I stayed in the den for 10 minutes, long enough for them to wonder what I was doing, long enough for them to feel the absence. When I returned, I saw Dylan huddled in the hallway, phone pressed tight to his ear. His voice was low, hurried, the way a man sounds when he's asking for reassurance but getting none. I passed him. He turned his back quickly, like a boy caught with a test key. In the kitchen, I found my daughter checking drawers again, more frantically this time. She didn't see me. She opened the third drawer by the fridge, where she once kept the wine openers. Now it held papers, receipts, and 2 envelopes she thumbed through desperately. When she turned and saw me, she flinched. "Dad," she said, voice breathless. "Did you take something from the file stack?" "No," I said. "I put something in." She stared at me, unsure whether it was a confession or a threat. "You should stop looking," I told her. "You already found what matters." "But there's nothing left to hide," I said, calm and firm, "and nothing left to win." She stood still, hands trembling slightly, mouth parted but silent. "I never needed to expose you," I added. "I just needed you to see yourselves." I walked out before she could respond, returned to the table. The guests were none the wiser. Someone was telling a story about a wedding in Napa. Another guest passed around a tray of pumpkin bars. To them, it was just another family gathering. But to Dylan and my daughter, it had become something else entirely. It was the scene of a slow collapse. They had bet everything on the assumption I wouldn't notice, wouldn't push back, wouldn't matter. And now they were caught in the worst kind of trap, not one sprung by force but by exposure. The room they built to impress, to control, now felt like a stage too bright with nowhere to hide. They whispered to each other when they thought no one could hear. She checked her phone. He scanned the windows. They weren't hosting anymore. They were reacting. To me, the man they thought they'd written out. The man they'd mistaken for history. That night, when the guests left and the dishes were soaking in the sink, I went to the guest room to retrieve my bag. packed it quietly, zipped it slow, left the door ajar. I didn't announce I was leaving, didn't say goodbye. They saw me go, heard the creak of the back door. The same one I had built with Margaret. The same one they forgot existed. I stepped into the cold night with everything I needed: documents, clarity, peace, and left behind everything that no longer served me. Let them panic. Let them wonder. Because I wasn't running. I was freeing myself. I didn't use the front door. That was theirs now. Polished and gleaming, a curated entrance meant for show. I used the back gate. The one I built in 1986. Posts set in concrete I mixed with my own hands. When Margaret wanted a quiet way into the garden without tracking mud through the kitchen. Funny how something simple and old can become the clearest path forward. The latch still clicked the same way. I closed it softly behind me, not out of stealth, but reverence. This gate had been mine before Dylan ever learned to shave, before my daughter thought she knew better than the man who raised her. It would be mine long after the lies they built came apart. I walked to the truck. The same '89 Chevy Dylan called outdated. It was waiting like a loyal dog. Engine cool, tires checked the night before. I'd packed it early that morning, while they were still asleep in their crisp sheets, dreaming of paperwork and power. Quiet moves always win. Inside the truck, I sat for a minute, just breathing. My bag sat beside me, not heavy, just the essentials. Legal documents, Margaret's will, 2 changes of clothes, my father's pocket knife, and the watch she wore every Sunday for church. Still ticking. I turned the key. The engine caught on the second try. As I pulled out of the driveway, the house loomed behind me in the rearview mirror. Still beautiful. Still full of history. Still mine. But I didn't need to fight for it anymore. I had already won. Winning, I realized, wasn't about who stayed in the house. It was about who left on their own terms. By the time Dylan and my daughter realized I was gone, their guests had started to trickle out. The table was cleared. The wine bottles mostly empty. The curated music still playing from hidden speakers in the corners of the ceiling. Someone must have asked, "Where's your dad?" Maybe they stalled. Lied. Said I was resting. But soon they'd go looking. Guest room empty. Kitchen no note. Hallway drawer half open, the envelope gone. And then they'd realize I hadn't just walked out. I had taken back everything that was mine. Bank accounts secured. Legal rights restored. Will updated and locked. Deed protected and unforgeable. And the evidence of their deceit, copied, cataloged, and in hands that didn't answer to them. They'd scramble. That I knew. I imagined Dylan flipping through the folders, finding blank pages where contracts used to be. Realizing the power of attorney he forged was filed under fraudulent claim. Seeing that my name had been removed from any automatic transfers. I could see him pacing, calling numbers that wouldn't pick up on Thanksgiving night, asking questions with no good answers. And my daughter? I pictured her sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching her phone, dialing my number and hearing it go straight to voicemail. Maybe she'd cry, maybe not, but she'd feel it. Like a weight she thought would never shift had suddenly vanished from the room. That's the price of betrayal. Not revenge. Not rage. Just the loss of trust so complete it becomes absence. And absence is louder than any accusation. I drove north, out of Santa Rosa, past vineyards lit soft with early dusk. The road curved with memory. I had taken this drive once with Margaret on our 15th anniversary, just to see the lake. She packed egg salad sandwiches, wore her red scarf that made her laugh every time the wind pulled at it. I still had that scarf. It was wrapped around the will in my bag. Protection, maybe, or just comfort. 2 hours later, I reached the cabin. A simple place, owned by an old friend who owed me nothing but respected me enough to hand over the key. No questions asked. Wooden porch, single room, view of the lake, peaceful. When I stepped inside, I didn't turn on the light, just set my bag down, took off my shoes, and sat by the window. Outside, the water shimmered. Inside, it was quiet. Not the silence of being ignored or dismissed or patronized, but true quiet. The kind that settles into your bones and says, "You've come far enough for now. Rest." I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was resetting the weight. The next day there would be voicemails, emails, maybe even legal letters trying to claw back control. But I had prepared for all of it. And I wouldn't answer any of it. Not for a while. Because for the first time in a long, long time, I was sitting in a space where I didn't need to defend who I was, or what I'd built, or why I left. And I knew with more certainty than I had known anything since Margaret passed. I hadn't been pushed out. I had chosen to walk away. And in doing so, I took back everything that mattered. There's a stillness that only comes after noise. I felt it that first morning in the cabin, before the sun had fully crested over the ridge, before the phone began to buzz with attempts to drag me back into their world. It was the kind of silence you don't trust at first, like it's too quiet, too wide. But then, slowly, it becomes a kind of breathing, a rhythm, a return. I stood at the window, mug in hand, watching the light fold gently across the lake like it was smoothing out all the creases in my soul. The steam from my tea curled around my wrist. No voices. No footfalls of a man circling the hallway trying to seize control. No daughter murmuring strategy over china and candles. No staging, no curated softness. No eyes tracking me like I might forget my own name. Just the tick of Margaret's watch in my pocket. And my breath. It had been a long time since I felt that my breath belonged to me. I'd chosen this cabin because it had nothing to offer but peace. No television. No internet. Just a small wood stove, a sink with a slow-draining faucet, and a creaky bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar and old stories. I didn't need more. I didn't want more. I wanted to remember how it felt to wake up not being handled, not being watched like a clock waiting to run out. Liberation isn't loud. It doesn't crash like thunder. It whispers. It's the moment you realize you don't have to explain your existence, that your worth doesn't hang on anyone's permission. That being alive isn't a burden someone else can repurpose for their gain. I spent the first day walking the trail behind the cabin. The leaves were thick underfoot, still holding on to the yellows and reds of late fall. The air smelled like pine and smoke and cold stone. I walked slow. No destination, just presence, just return. At one bend, I stopped and closed my eyes. I let the wind move through me. I said nothing, but in that silence, I felt Margaret again. Not like a ghost, not like a wound. Just presence. The kind that wraps around you the way her arms used to when I came in from mowing the lawn. Sweat on my collar, her kiss warm on my cheek. I told her, in my mind, that I'd kept my promise. I didn't give up the home. I didn't sell the dignity she helped build. Brick by brick, room by room. I didn't let our daughter turn it into a possession. It stayed what it always was. A sanctuary. Even if now I had to find my sanctuary elsewhere. Liberation means letting go of needing people to understand why you left. They'll come up with stories. They'll paint you stubborn, confused, bitter, ungrateful. Let them. You don't need to live in the echo of their assumptions. You just need to live. That night I lit a small fire in the stove. Opened the letter Margaret wrote to me the year before she passed. A birthday note I'd folded into the back of a book and forgot about until I left for the cabin. It wasn't long, just a few lines. But one sentence stayed with me. If ever our home becomes a place that no longer remembers our love, go where the sky is wide and start over. I smiled, because I had, not out of spite, not out of fear, but out of quiet, steady defiance against forgetting who I was. Out here in the hush of pine and lake, I remembered, not just what they tried to take, but what they could never touch. My hands, my silence, my past, and my right to walk away without apology. Morning light broke like a slow blessing. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a steady softening of darkness. The way truth often comes when you're no longer asking for it. I sat in the cabin's single wooden chair, wrapped in Margaret's scarf, watching steam rise from my coffee like breath from the earth itself. The lake didn't speak. It didn't need to. Silence was the language now, and I understood it. Out there, beyond the frost-glazed grass and the edge of the tree line, the world moved on without me, without questions, without expectation. For the first time in years, I didn't feel behind. I didn't feel less than. I didn't feel like a man being waited out by people too polite to admit they wanted me gone. I felt like myself. No version. No role. Just Harold. Inside my cardigan pocket, Margaret's watch ticked slow and soft. I took it out and held it to my ear, not because I doubted it worked, but because its sound meant something more now. It had counted through decades of marriage, through chemo appointments and anniversaries, through the birth of our daughter and the death of her mother, through my long quiet after Margaret passed. And now it was counting something different. Forward. It didn't tick for obligation anymore. Ticked for freedom. I held it in my hand a while longer, then set it gently on the windowsill, where the sun could warm its face. A small act, but it felt like opening a new door. No messages came that morning. No apologies. No attempts at redemption. Just silence. But this time, it didn't feel like the silence of someone else's manipulation. It was mine. They hadn't earned my words. Not yet. My daughter would eventually try. I knew that. Guilt always circles back. There would be letters. Long ones. Meant to explain, to soften what can't be softened. Maybe she'd tell stories of misunderstanding, of bad influence, of misread intentions. Maybe she'd cry again, and I would read those words with the same quiet that brought me here. But I wouldn't answer. Not immediately. Not because I wanted her to suffer. Because I wanted her to sit with the silence. To feel it. To understand that what they tried to erase can't be rebuilt with regret alone. Let them walk through that big house and hear the echoes where my voice used to be. Let them open the drawers and find them empty of things, but full of consequence. Let them stand in the hallway, feeling the absence like a pressure in the air. Sometimes the loudest message you can send isn't spoken. It's the space you leave behind. That morning, I took out a notebook and began to write. Not a response, not a defense. Just memories. Not for them. For me. Where Margaret laughed the loudest. Where the chair creaked when I rocked our daughter to sleep. What it smelled like the first day we moved in. Fresh paint, sawdust, and hope. I wanted to remember the life I had, not the one they tried to repackage. I wanted to honor it, not by clinging, but by letting go without letting them define what that meant. I didn't need to storm out. I didn't need to make a scene. I just had to leave, with my truth intact. And in that decision, I found something I thought was gone. Dignity. Not given. Not granted. Claimed. That watch on the windowsill ticked on, marking time not lost, but reclaimed. People think justice needs to be loud. But I've learned the loudest truths don't always come with gavel strikes or shouting matches. Sometimes, they arrive on a quiet morning, in a cabin no one else knows about, with the slow rise of steam from a cup of tea and the soft tick of a watch you almost forgot to carry. I stayed at that lake cabin for 5 days. Just enough time for the noise inside me to settle. I didn't reach out, didn't defend, didn't check voicemails. I let them pile up like autumn leaves. Unraked, untouched, left for the wind to sort. I thought I might feel anger, but it never came. What came instead was clarity. They didn't just try to take a house. They tried to erase a man they thought was done. They tried to repackage 30 years of sweat, love, and quiet labor into something more manageable. Something convenient. Something they could inherit early, like a hand-me-down they didn't want to wait for. But you can't inherit a life built on integrity. You have to earn your place in it. And they didn't. They traded love for control, trust for strategy, presence for performance. And old, slow, quiet, became their obstacle. But I didn't scream. I didn't plead. I didn't beg to be seen. I watched. I listened. I prepared. And then I walked. Not to flee. To liberate. To say with my silence what no argument could say. You don't get to define my worth just because I made you. The final morning before I left the cabin, I folded Margaret's scarf and placed it back in my bag. I slipped her watch into my shirt pocket, over my heart. Then I stood on the porch and looked at the lake one last time. A breeze moved across the water, soft and persistent. And I thought, this is what strength looks like. Not in fists, not in revenge, but in restraint. In walking away not because you lost, but because you remembered your value. When I returned to Santa Rosa, I didn't go home. I met with my attorney, quietly moved the house into a trust, finalized the protection paperwork, and updated every document they once tried to manipulate. Then I drove past the house, just once. From the outside, the porch light was on. There were no silhouettes at the window, no music, no warmth, just a structure. The home, the real home, was gone, because I had carried it with me. Margaret's laughter, my hands in the soil, the birthday dinners, the hallway squeak on the third board from the wall, the whispered prayers. They thought the deed gave them ownership, but they never understood. What made it ours could never be printed or notarized. It was earned, and I still held it. I don't need the last word. Don't need the last laugh. I don't even need an apology. What I have is better. A clear heart, a steady hand, and a life still mine to live.